Hi, welcome to another story. Before we begin, one thing matters. These stories are written with intention, not created at random. There is a human presence behind every word you hear.
I, Ruth Caldwell, never told my Sarah about the secret cellar full of proofs. For 3 years, I watched gold digger Damon Pierce control her bit by bit, but my silent patience armed the perfect revenge, ready to explode when he tried to break in and take everything. If you are drawn to stories where quiet endurance becomes unstoppable justice, subscribe and stay with me, because this is not a tale of shouting or courts, but of silence sharpened into a blade. I am telling this years later, from my old Spanish-style house in Los Angeles, the one with cracked terracotta tiles and bougainvillea, climbing the walls, where the past still breathes through wood, dust, and memory. I am 68 years old now, a widow by choice of fate rather than will. And silence has been my closest companion since the day my wife died. People assume grief screams, but mine settled instead, deep and slow, like fog rolling in from the Pacific and refusing to lift. My wife was the architect of our life, the careful one, the woman who believed preparation was love expressed in advance. When she passed, after months of hospitals that smelled of disinfectant and fear, she left behind more than grief. She left systems, letters, safeguards, and the cellar beneath our house that no one but me ever entered. Even Sarah did not know, because loving a child sometimes means withholding truth, until the world proves it is safe. The funeral was held on a bright Los Angeles afternoon that felt cruel in its cheerfulness. Sunlight poured over white chairs and polished wood, mocking the black fabric clinging to my skin. Sarah stood beside me, fragile but radiant, in that way youth often is even in mourning. And I remember thinking that predators always circle the wounded herd. That was the day Damon Pierce appeared, all soft smiles and attentive eyes. A man who knew exactly when to lower his voice and when to offer a hand. He was younger than Sarah by a few years, charming in a way that felt practiced, the kind of charm that reflects whatever the other person wants to see. I noticed him because my wife once told me to always watch the man who studies the room before he studies the woman. At the reception afterward, Damon never let go of Sarah's elbow. He spoke gently, but his grip was firm. And when she laughed, he watched her more than the joke. I watched him watch her. That was the first moment my silence began to sharpen, because instinct is not paranoia, when it has been earned through decades of observing human nature. He asked polite questions about the house, about how long we had lived there, about whether it had been remodeled. Harmless questions, people would say. But the cellar below my feet seemed to hum that afternoon, as if warning me that curiosity is often hunger dressed in manners. After my wife's death, the house changed its sound. At night, the pipes groaned differently, and the floorboards seemed to sigh. I spent hours sitting alone at the kitchen table, my hands wrapped around cold mugs of coffee, listening to the city breathe outside. That was when I descended into the cellar more often, carrying a single bulb of light, inhaling the damp, mineral scent of concrete and old paper. The cellar was not large, but it was deliberate. Steel shelves, fireproof cabinets, locked chests. Inside were documents, journals, jewelry passed down through my wife's family, and the trust paperwork designed to protect Sarah from exactly the kind of man Damon would soon reveal himself to be. My wife had written a note on the first folder, her handwriting steady and calm, reminding me that patience is power when wielded correctly. Sarah married Damon quickly. Grief compresses time, and he used that expertly. The ceremony was small, rushed, and filled with promises spoken too fast, to echo. I stood in the back, clapping politely, my face a mask carved by years of restraint. Damon kissed her like a man claiming territory, not a partner sharing joy. People congratulated me, telling me how lucky Sarah was to have found love so soon after loss. I smiled, because silence, when chosen, is often mistaken for approval. Inside, I catalogued details the way my wife taught me, storing impressions like evidence long before they would be needed. Living alone sharpened my awareness. I noticed when Sarah stopped calling as often, when her texts became shorter, more guarded. I noticed when Damon answered her phone once, his voice smooth but cool, explaining she was busy. I told myself nothing, because silence internally is where truth first grows roots. At night, I returned to the cellar, sitting on a small stool, reviewing papers not because I needed to, but because ritual steadies fear. I touched the locks, checked the hinges, and listened to the quiet hum of the house above me, trusting that patience was still my strongest ally. My wife used to say that the most dangerous storms gather without thunder. Damon was that storm. He never raised his voice in front of me. He smiled, thanked me, offered help I did not request, but his eyes lingered on doorways, on walls, on the floor beneath his feet, as if measuring something invisible. Once, during a visit, he asked casually if the house had a basement. I answered truthfully but incompletely, telling him it had old storage that was unsafe and off-limits. He laughed it off, but his jaw tightened for a fraction of a second. That was enough. Silence does not mean blindness. It means observation without interference. Years later, when people ask how I endured watching my daughter slip further away, I tell them endurance is not passive. It is active restraint. Every instinct screamed to confront, to accuse, to rescue. But I had learned, through love and loss, that premature confrontation only teaches an abuser how to hide better. Instead, I listened, I remembered, I waited. The cellar waited with me, holding proof like breath held underwater. And it was during one quiet night, long before the locks were tested, that I realized Damon was not simply curious about the house. He was planning something far more violent than love. And that was when my silence truly became intentional. The marriage unfolded the way sudden weather does, in Los Angeles, all brightness on the surface and pressure building underneath. Sarah moved into Damon's place at first. A modern rental with glass walls and polished concrete floors that reflected everything and revealed nothing. When she came to visit me, she spoke quickly, as if time were rationed, and her eyes flicked toward her phone with the nervous loyalty of someone awaiting permission. Damon accompanied her often, positioning himself between us on the couch, his arm draped casually over her shoulders like a claim, rather than a comfort. I watched without comment, reminding myself that observation is a form of care when action would only accelerate harm. I began to notice the small recalibrations that happen when control takes root. Sarah stopped wearing the bracelet her mother had given her, the one she never removed even to sleep. When I asked about it lightly, Damon answered for her, joking that it had snagged on things, that it was impractical. Sarah laughed, but the sound was thin, rehearsed. Silence inside me deepened, not from fear, but from focus. I was learning the rhythm of their life, the way he spoke over her pauses, the way she deferred decisions that once came easily. Patterns form quietly, and once seen, they cannot be unseen. It was during this period that I began my diary, not a journal of feelings, but a ledger of facts, dates, times, exact phrases. My wife taught me that memory is unreliable under stress, but ink does not flinch. I hid the notebook behind a false panel in the cellar, its pages thick and unassuming, its cover plain. The first entry was simple, noting the day Sarah canceled dinner, because Damon had planned something else without telling her. I wrote the time of the text, the wording, the delay before her apology. No judgment, only record. Silence, documented, becomes something else entirely. Damon's interest in finances revealed itself next, masked as concern. He asked about Sarah's accounts, about joint planning, about how wise it was to consolidate resources. He framed control as efficiency, isolation as protection. When Sarah hesitated, he smiled patiently, the way one does with a child who needs convincing. I watched him closely the day he suggested she reduce her work hours, citing stress. Her shoulders slumped with relief at first, then stiffened as if realizing something had been taken without being named. That night, I added another entry to the diary, my handwriting steady, my breath slow. Visits became less frequent. When Sarah did come, she seemed distracted, scanning the house with attention she could not explain. Damon wandered, opening doors, peering into corners, asking again about storage. I repeated my warning calmly, telling him the lower level was unsafe and locked for a reason. He nodded, but his eyes lingered on the staircase, leading down, calculating. Silence sharpened again, this time edged with resolve. I checked the cellar locks more often, reinforcing habits my wife had drilled into me long before Damon's shadow crossed our threshold. I confided nothing to Sarah. Not yet. Protection sometimes looks like distance, and I could feel her drifting even as I stood still. Instead, I reached out quietly to Jacob Winters, my wife's godson, and a man who understood discretion as instinct. He had always kept an eye on Sarah from afar, the way extended family does when they know love alone is not armor enough. I asked him to observe, not intervene. He agreed without questions, and that agreement felt like the first breath before a long dive. The diary filled steadily. Damon's tone shifts. Sarah's canceled calls, financial transfers explained away as temporary. I noted the way Damon flinched when I mentioned my wife's name, the way he redirected conversations about legacy. Silence became my discipline. I did not confront, I did not accuse. I watched, and I wrote, trusting that the truth, once complete, would not need embellishment. At night, the cellar light cast long shadows on the walls, as I reviewed entries, the smell of paper and metal grounding me in purpose. People often mistake silence for weakness. They do not understand the patience required to let a pattern reveal itself fully. I understood, because my wife prepared me for this kind of waiting, even if she never named Damon specifically. Each observation added weight, and I could feel the structure forming beneath the surface, like beams hidden inside walls. The more Damon smiled, the more I listened, the more Sarah withdrew, the more carefully I documented. Silence was no longer just internal. It had become observational, deliberate, and irreversible. It was late one evening, as I closed the diary and secured it behind steel, that Jacob sent me a message asking if we could talk soon, privately. His words were measured, but urgency hummed beneath them. I stood at the top of the cellar stairs, my hand on the light switch, sensing that observation was about to give way to something darker. And that was when I realized the silence I had been cultivating was about to be tested in ways I had not yet imagined. The isolation did not arrive like a slammed door. It seeped in, polite and gradual, disguised as concern. Damon began to frame my presence as a source of stress for Sarah, suggesting she needed space to heal, to build her marriage without outside influence. He never forbade contact outright. He merely complicated it. Calls were returned late. Messages went unanswered. When I asked gently if everything was all right, Sarah reassured me too quickly, her voice tight, her words chosen, as if someone else might be listening. Silence shifted again, no longer only observational, but alert, coiled, and ready. Jacob noticed it too. He told me Sarah had stopped meeting friends for coffee, stopped attending gatherings she once loved. Damon managed her calendar the way a banker manages accounts, approving, denying, reallocating time, as if it were currency. When Sarah did appear in public, she was always with him, always smiling, always a step behind. I wrote it all down, dates, locations, excuses repeated too often to be coincidence. Silence became isolating by design, and I could feel the walls closing in around her, even from miles away. The first bruise appeared on a Wednesday afternoon, though no one named it that at first. Sarah arrived unexpectedly, her sunglasses too large, her movements careful. She said she had tripped on the stairs, laughed it off, and turned her face away from the light. I said nothing. I offered tea. I listened. When she finally removed the glasses, there it was, a purple bloom just below her cheekbone, already turning yellow at the edges. My chest tightened, but my voice remained steady. I asked no questions that could push her back into denial. That night, alone in the cellar, I wrote every detail I could recall, my pen pressing hard into the paper. After that, the explanations multiplied. A doorframe, a clumsy fall, an accident in the kitchen. Each mark arrived with a story already prepared, each story rehearsed enough to sound plausible. I noticed the way Sarah flinched at sudden sounds, the way her hands trembled when she poured coffee. Damon always hovered nearby, attentive, apologetic, eager to explain. He played the concerned husband flawlessly. Silence demanded that I let him believe his performance was convincing. Inside, my resolve hardened into something unbreakable. The isolation extended beyond bruises. Damon began controlling Sarah's finances openly now, framing it as protection. He spoke of investments, of planning for children, of ensuring stability. Sarah's independence eroded quietly. She stopped paying her own bills. She asked Damon for permission to spend. When I asked her once, carefully, whether she felt comfortable, she looked at me with fear flickering beneath obedience. She said he knew best. That sentence echoed in my mind long after she left, and I recorded it word for word in the diary, knowing its weight would matter later. Jacob confirmed what I feared. Damon had been telling people that I was unstable, that grief had made me paranoid. He suggested that Sarah limit contact with me for her own emotional safety. I smiled when I heard this, thanked Jacob for the information, and added it to the record. Abusers isolate by rewriting reality. Silence allows their narrative to unfold completely, exposing its seams. I let Damon believe his version of events was uncontested, even as I preserved the truth beneath my feet. The cellar became my sanctuary. The air down there was cool, damp, and steady, unlike the shifting ground above. I reviewed documents, checked locks, and updated my diary with meticulous care. I photographed bruises when Sarah visited, asking only for permission to take pictures for medical reasons. She agreed without protest, her eyes distant. Each image was time-stamped, stored securely, backed up in places Damon would never think to look. Silence, now fully isolating, was also becoming fortified. There were moments when my restraint felt unbearable. When Sarah cried quietly at my kitchen table, apologizing for being difficult. When Damon sent messages, dripping with false concern, asking me not to upset her. Each time, I chose patience over confrontation, trusting that exposure, not accusation, would dismantle him. Silence does not mean inaction. It means waiting until action cannot be twisted against you. I repeated this to myself like a prayer, steadying my breath. The turning point came the night Sarah missed a call she would never have missed before. Hours passed. No reply. Jacob reached out to say Damon had canceled her plans again, citing exhaustion. I stood in the dark kitchen, the house humming softly, and felt something shift. Isolation had reached its peak. The silence around Sarah was no longer just a tactic, it was a warning. And that was when I understood that documentation alone would no longer be enough. The first time I realized my silence had transformed into something irreversible was the night. I labeled a folder with a date instead of a feeling. It was late. The city outside, muted by fog drifting inland, and the cellar smelled stronger than usual, a mix of damp concrete, cold metal, and old paper. I sat on the stool beneath the bare bulb, my knees aching, my hands steady, organizing what had once felt unthinkable to collect. Photographs, bank statements, screenshots, notes written in my own careful hand. Silence was no longer simply watching or waiting. It had become a system, a structure, a map. And every piece of evidence slid into place with a quiet certainty that frightened me more than anger ever could. I began documenting with a precision that surprised even me. Each bruise Sarah allowed me to photograph was captured from multiple angles, under consistent light, with a ruler beside it to show scale. I learned how skin heals, how colors shift from deep violet to sickly yellow, how long pain lingers beneath makeup and excuses. I noted what she said each time, writing her words exactly as spoken, even when they contradicted previous explanations. Especially then. I did not comfort her with lies. I comforted her with presence, with tea held between both hands, with silence that did not demand she protect Damon's image. When she left, I locked the cellar and backed everything up again, knowing that truth is fragile, until it is redundant. Money leaves fingerprints too. Damon underestimated that. I traced transfers from Sarah's accounts into joint holdings, then into places her name barely touched. I noted dates that coincided with arguments she mentioned in passing, with cancelled visits, with unexplained apologies. Patterns emerged slowly, like photographs developing in chemical baths. He framed control as responsibility, theft as planning. I printed statements, highlighted figures, and stored them in fireproof drawers my wife had insisted on years earlier. Sitting there, surrounded by proof, I could almost hear her voice reminding me that love prepares for what we hope will never happen. Jacob became more than an observer then. He brought me information quietly, carefully, never in writing. He told me Damon had been asking questions in places he should not. Speaking to acquaintances about inheritance laws, about trusts, about what happens when a spouse is deemed unstable. Jacob described Damon's tone as curious but impatient, polite but probing. That night, I added an entry noting Jacob's exact phrasing, the pause before he said the word accident. The air in the cellar felt heavier after that, as if the house itself understood the direction this was moving. Damon's visits to my home grew more deliberate. He wandered less aimlessly now, his questions sharper, his interest in the lower level less disguised. Once, he laughed and asked what I was hiding down there, his eyes bright with something that was not humor. I smiled and deflected, my voice calm, my posture relaxed, while my mind recorded everything. After he left, I reinforced the locks, added a secondary deadbolt, and installed cameras so small they vanished into shadow. Silence adapts, it evolves, it anticipates. The diary thickened quickly. It became heavy in my hands, its pages dense with facts that felt almost unreal when read together. Dates aligned, behaviors repeated, excuses recycled. Damon's charm fractured under the weight of consistency. I did not reread entries often, because dwelling can weaken resolve. Instead, I focused on accuracy. I checked timestamps. I verified accounts. I made copies. Silence, documented properly, leaves no room for reinterpretation later. Sarah sensed something shifting, though she could not name it. She asked once why I seemed calmer than before, why I no longer pressed her to visit more often. I told her truthfully that I trusted her strength, even when she could not feel it herself. That answer unsettled her more than confrontation would have. She lingered longer that day, touching the edge of the table, staring at the hallway as if weighing whether to ask a forbidden question. She did not. Silence still held. The cellar became less a hiding place, and more a vault. I tested the cameras repeatedly, adjusting angles, ensuring sound capture, checking that night vision worked flawlessly. I practiced descending the stairs quietly, memorizing each creak, each safe step. Preparation grounded me. Fear thrives in chaos, but planning starves it. Each measure I took felt like laying bricks in a wall Damon would one day run into at full speed. One evening, Jacob called, later than usual. His voice was low, controlled, but urgency pulsed beneath it. He told me Damon had joked about how accidents happen when people fall downstairs, how tragedy often unlocks complicated assets. I thanked him, and ended the call, my hand resting on the counter longer than necessary. Downstairs, I opened the diary to a fresh page and wrote until my wrist ached. Silence had reached its most dangerous phase. It was no longer only recording harm. It was now racing against it. I stood at the cellar door long after midnight, listening to the house settle. Aware that documentation alone would not deter a man who believed himself clever. Damon was growing impatient, hungry, and as I secured the final lock and switched off the light, I understood with chilling clarity that the silence I had built was about to be challenged directly, not with words, but with force. The first pressure did not come as a threat. It arrived disguised as familiarity. Damon began speaking about the cellar as if it were already his concern, his responsibility, his right. He mentioned moisture, liability, old houses hiding dangers beneath them, all said with a smile that did not reach his eyes. Each time he brought it up, I answered calmly, repeating the same line about structural instability and locked access. Repetition frustrates manipulators. I could see it in the way his jaw tightened, the way his patience thinned. Silence, once tolerated, was now provoking him simply by refusing to move. I reinforced my routines immediately. The locks were checked morning and night, the cameras tested again, their tiny lenses catching every shift of shadow. I memorized the sound of each stair, each hinge, each settling beam, until the house spoke to me in a language only vigilance understands. The cellar smelled sharper now, metal and stone and paper layered with anticipation. I added a new folder labeled only with Damon's name, sliding into it copies of everything that tied him to intention, rather than coincidence. Silence becomes threatening when it stops reacting. Sarah arrived one afternoon with a tension I had not seen before, her hands twisting together as she stood in the doorway. Damon waited in the car. She told me he was worried about my safety, that he thought the house was too big, too old, too risky for someone my age. I listened without interrupting, noting the phrasing, the concern weaponized as care. When she finished, I told her gently that the house had protected me for decades, and that I trusted it more than I trusted urgency. She looked at me then, really looked, as if sensing that my stillness concealed something she had not yet earned the right to know. The pressure escalated quickly after that. Damon stopped asking, and began suggesting. He mentioned renovations, inspections, contractors who could evaluate the lower level. I refused each proposal politely, firmly, always with the same explanation. Consistency unnerves those who rely on cracks. I could feel him circling, testing boundaries the way a predator tests a fence. That night, I slept lightly, one ear tuned to the subtle rhythms of the house, my body alert even in rest. Jacob warned me that Damon was growing reckless. He had complained about obstacles that should not exist. He spoke of impatience of timelines. I wrote it all down, my pen scratching louder than usual in the quiet cellar. The air felt colder, heavier, as if the space itself were bracing. I reviewed the trust documents again, tracing clauses with my finger, reminding myself that legality can be as sharp as any blade when used precisely. Silence had armed itself with law, with proof, with foresight. Sarah's bruises became harder to hide. She wore long sleeves in warm weather, avoided mirrors, flinched when Damon raised his voice, even slightly. Once, when she thought I was not looking, she touched her arm as if confirming it was still there. I photographed discreetly, asking permission only with my eyes. She nodded, resigned, trusting me in a way she could not yet articulate. Each image tightened the coil inside me. Silence was no longer passive endurance. It was containment. The cameras caught Damon lingering near the cellar door during a visit, his hand brushing the knob, his posture tense with calculation. I watched the footage later, frame by frame, noting the exact second his smile faded when he realized the door would not yield. I reinforced the internal latch after that, adding a silent alarm linked only to my phone. Preparation does not calm fear, but it channels it into action that cannot be easily undone. Damon confronted me indirectly soon after, his tone light, almost playful. He joked about secrets, about what older generations hide, about how transparency strengthens families. I met his gaze evenly, and told him some things are preserved, precisely because they are fragile. His laugh rang hollow. Silence, when mirrored, becomes a provocation. I could feel the shift then, the moment his curiosity hardened into intent. That night, sleep eluded me. The house creaked softly, the city distant and indifferent. I stood at the top of the cellar stairs, my hand on the railing, listening to the hum of systems working quietly. Below locks, cameras, documents, proof. Damon believed pressure would make me yield. He did not yet understand that pressure was exactly what silence had been designed to withstand. I closed the door and turned the key slowly, aware that the next move would not be polite, indirect, or deniable. The silence I had cultivated was now openly threatened, and when silence is threatened, it reveals its final purpose. And somewhere beyond my walls, Damon was already deciding how far he was willing to go. The crack did not announce itself with noise. It arrived as a pause that lasted half a second too long. Sarah stood in my kitchen one afternoon, her coat still on, her eyes hollowed by exhaustion that sleep could not fix. Damon was late, she said, delayed by work, though the words sounded rehearsed. As she set her bag down, her sleeve slipped just enough to expose a bruise that was newer than the last, darker, angrier. Our eyes met, and in that instant, something fractured, not loudly, not completely, just enough to let truth breathe. Silence, after years of holding, began to strain. I did not ask her what happened. I did not need to. Instead, I poured tea, the familiar ritual grounding both of us, the steam rising between us, like a barrier and a bridge at once. She watched my hands, my calm, my lack of urgency, and her breathing slowed to match mine. Abusers thrive on chaos and reaction. Safety lives in predictability. When she finally spoke, it was not about Damon. It was about being tired, bone tired. The kind of tired that makes you forget who you were before someone else began telling you who to be. I listened, storing every word, feeling the crack widen quietly. She asked then, almost casually, whether I had ever regretted keeping things from her. The question hovered in the air, dangerous and delicate. I chose my answer with care, telling her that secrets are not always betrayals, that sometimes they are shelters built in advance. Her eyes filled, but she did not cry. Instead, she nodded, as if confirming something she had suspected without proof. Silence trembled, holding its shape by will alone. I excused myself briefly, and returned with a thin folder. Not the diary, not the full truth, but a fragment designed to test readiness. Inside were a few pages, dates, notes, nothing sensational, just enough. I placed it on the table between us, and waited. Sarah read slowly, her face changing not with shock, but with recognition. This was not revelation, it was validation. She looked up at me, fear and relief warring in her expression, and whispered that she thought she was imagining things. The crack widened. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway froze us both. Damon's arrival was early, unexpected. Sarah's shoulders tensed automatically, her body responding before her mind could catch up. I slid the folder back toward me, covering it calmly, my movements unhurried. Silence snapped back into place, strained but intact. Damon entered moments later, his smile sharp, his gaze scanning the room. He sensed the shift immediately. Predators always do. Dinner passed with forced normalcy. Damon talked too much, laughed too loudly, watched Sarah too closely. His eyes flicked once toward the hallway leading to the cellar stairs, lingering there just a beat longer than necessary. I felt the warning settle in my gut, heavy and cold. After they left, I checked the cameras, the locks, the alarms. Everything held. But the crack remained, and cracks invite pressure. That night, Jacob called again. He did not soften his words this time. Damon was making plans, speaking more openly, testing reactions. He believed time was running out. I thanked Jacob and ended the call, my hand steady even as my pulse quickened. Downstairs, the cellar felt different, charged, as if aware that concealment was nearing its limit. I reviewed footage again, noting Damon's movements, his impatience etched into posture and pace. Sarah returned 2 days later, alone. Damon had errands, she said, though her eyes told a different story. She asked to see the diary. Not all of it, just enough to understand. I hesitated only a moment before agreeing. Trust, once extended, cannot be retracted without cost. We sat together on the cellar stairs, the air cool and damp, the light low. She read silently, her face draining of color, as patterns solidified into undeniable truth. Tears fell then, soundless, absorbing into the concrete. Above us, the house creaked. Footsteps sounded where none should have been. We froze, listening. A door opened. Closed. Keys jangled softly. Damon was home early. Too early. I closed the diary slowly, my mind already moving through contingencies. Silence, cracked open, was about to be tested under direct pressure. The sound of the cellar door handle turning echoed through the space, metal against metal, deliberate and probing. Sarah's breath caught. I placed a hand over hers, steady and firm, as the first unmistakable sign arrived, continue. That Damon no longer intended to ask. The handle turned again, harder this time, testing resistance rather than curiosity. The metal protested with a dull groan that vibrated through the stairs and into my bones. Sarah's hand tightened around mine, her pulse frantic beneath my fingers. I could feel her body trying to decide between flight and obedience, years of conditioning colliding with the instinct to survive. I did not move. I did not speak. Silence, even cracked, still had authority if it was held correctly. Ruth, Damon's voice floated down, falsely light, coated in concern. He said my name, the way one does when pretending patience, stretching the syllable, listening for weakness in the echo. I did not answer. The house responded instead, settling, creaking, breathing around us. I watched the camera feed on my phone without looking at it directly, trusting my peripheral vision. He stood at the top of the stairs, posture rigid, eyes narrowed, hand still on the handle. This was no longer improvisation. This was intent. Sarah shifted, instinctively preparing to rise, to explain, to protect him even now. I tightened my grip just enough to anchor her. She looked at me then, really looked, and something in her expression changed. Not fear, understanding, the kind that hurts before it heals. The silence between us was no longer isolating. It was shared. Damon tried the handle again. The alarm did not sound, not yet. He laughed softly, a sound meant to reassure himself more than us. You really should let me check down there, he called. For safety. The word landed heavy, obscene in its irony. I remained seated, counting breaths, counting seconds, letting him show exactly who he was to the cameras, to the record, to the truth that no longer belonged only to me. Finally, he stepped back. Footsteps retreated. A door slammed upstairs. The engine started. Silence rushed back in, louder than any confrontation. Sarah sagged against me, shaking now, the adrenaline finding release. I held her without words, knowing this moment mattered more than any speech I could give. The crack had widened into a fissure, and there would be no sealing it again. When the house was quiet, truly quiet, I helped Sarah upstairs. We sat at the kitchen table until dawn, the sky outside shifting from black to gray, to pale gold. She asked no questions she did not already know the answers to. She simply said, finally, that she was scared of what he might do next. I told her the truth, calmly, evenly. That fear was no longer something she had to face alone. As the sun rose, my phone vibrated softly with a notification from the cellar camera system. Motion detected, time-stamped, stored, proof building itself even as we spoke. I looked at the screen, then at my daughter, and understood that the silence I had nurtured for years was no longer only mine to wield. It had become visible. And Damon, whether he knew it yet or not, had just crossed the line that would end him. Night in Los Angeles has a particular sound when something is wrong. It is not sirens, or voices, or even movement. It is the absence of rhythm. The air feels suspended, as if the city itself is holding its breath. That was the sound I woke to the night Damon decided silence no longer deserved respect. I lay still for several seconds, listening past the hum of the refrigerator, past the distant traffic, attuned to the subtle language of my house. Then it came. A low metallic scrape, careful, deliberate. The unmistakable sound of someone testing a lock they believe they can defeat. I did not rush. Panic feeds intruders. Instead, I reached for my phone and brought the camera feed up slowly. My movements precise, despite the pounding in my chest. The cellar door filled the screen, bathed in infrared gray. And there he was. Damon, hoodie pulled tight, gloves on his hands, his face stripped of charm and performance. This was not curiosity. This was theft with intent. He crouched, working a tool into the seam. His jaw clenched, his body tense with entitlement. I watched him violate the boundary I had protected for decades, and something inside me settled with frightening calm. The first alarm tripped when he forced the secondary latch. Not the audible one. The silent one. My phone vibrated once, sharp and decisive. Damon froze, listening. The cameras caught the moment his confidence flickered. The second he realized this was not an abandoned secret but a guarded one. He muttered something under his breath, frustration bleeding through restraint. Instead of leaving, he doubled down. That choice would cost him everything. I stayed where I was, seated at the kitchen table, my hands flat on the wood, grounding myself in the present. I did not call out. I did not confront. Confrontation gives abusers a stage. Evidence gives them an ending. On the screen, Damon forced the final lock with a grunt, the metal giving way, after a sharp, violent twist. The door swung inward. The cellar lights snapped on automatically, flooding the space with unforgiving brightness. He hesitated only a second before descending. The cameras captured everything. His slow steps, his widening eyes, the way his posture shifted from arrogance to disbelief, as he took in the shelves, the cabinets, the chests. He moved fast, then, rifling through drawers, pulling files, skimming pages, without understanding what he was seeing. Names, dates, clauses, his own name, appearing more than once. I could almost hear his breathing through the screen, shallow and sharp. Silence had been violated, and in response, it was recording him without mercy. He found the jewelry next, lifting a velvet tray with a sound of reverence that made my skin crawl. He weighed pieces in his gloved hand, calculating, already translating memory into cash. Then he reached the fireproof cabinet. The one my wife labeled in her neat, precise script. He tried the handle. Locked. He cursed softly, the sound clear through the microphone. That was when impatience took over, when he began to pry at it, leaving marks that would speak louder than any accusation. Upstairs, the house remained still. No sirens, no voices, no interruption. Damon worked quickly now, frantic, aware that time was no longer on his side. He pulled papers free, stuffing them into a bag, missing the significance of what he left behind in his haste. He did not understand that partial theft only strengthens a case. Silence does not need everything to prove its point. It needs enough. The final alarm triggered when he crossed the invisible boundary near the diary vault. This one was not silent. A low, resonant tone filled the cellar, not loud enough to alert neighbors, but unmistakable to the man trapped beneath it. Damon panicked then. The cameras caught it clearly. The loss of control. The sudden feral urgency. He abandoned finesse, yanking at drawers, knocking over boxes, exposing himself fully to the lens. He was no longer a husband, no longer charming. He was exactly what he had always been. A thief caught mid-act. He fled moments later, scrambling up the stairs, slamming the door behind him with enough force to rattle the walls. The engine roared to life outside, tires squealing briefly before fading into the night. I did not move until the house settled again, until the alarms reset, and the cameras returned to idle. Only then did I stand, my knees stiff, my breath slow and controlled. Silence had been broken. But it had also captured everything it needed. I walked to the cellar door at dawn, surveying the damage without emotion. The locks destroyed, papers scattered, marks on steel that told their own story. I knelt and picked up a page Damon had dropped, smoothing it carefully, recognizing my wife's handwriting instantly. I knew then that the next phase would not be quiet. It would be precise, and it would be final. Morning arrived without mercy, thin light slipping through the curtains, as if nothing had happened. I brewed coffee and waited for Sarah at the kitchen table. The house smelling of scorched beans and dust, disturbed by intrusion. When she came down the stairs, she read my face before I spoke. I did not dramatize the night. I did not soften it either. I showed her the footage, quietly, letting the images speak with the authority only truth possesses. Damon's gloved hands, his face stripped bare. His voice, impatient and cruel. Sarah watched without interruption, her breathing steadying as denial finally loosened its grip. When the video ended, she closed her eyes and nodded once, a small, decisive movement that felt heavier than any scream. We moved downstairs together. The cellar looked violated, but not defeated, like a battlefield after retreat. I pointed out what was missing, and what remained, explaining how partial theft exposes motive more clearly than success. I showed her the diary then, not fragments, not hints, but the full record. Dates aligned, patterns locked into place. Sarah traced her finger along the ink, whispering her own words back to herself, as if reclaiming them. I told her what the trust did, and when it activated, how my wife had insisted it be irrevocable, how it required proof rather than accusations. Silence had been the condition. Evidence was the key. Damon arrived later that afternoon, unannounced, confidence rehearsed, but fraying at the edges. He spoke quickly, apologizing for the alarm, inventing a story about checking on noises, about concern for safety. I let him talk. Sarah stood beside me, not behind. When he finished, I set the laptop on the table and played the clip he could not talk over. His face drained of color in real time. He reached for Sarah instinctively, then stopped when she stepped back. That distance was the moment everything changed. I slid the documents across the table next, the diary, the bank statements, the timestamps, the trust summary. I explained calmly what would happen next, not as a threat, but as a sequence already in motion. The trust would freeze access. The marital protections he relied on would dissolve under documented abuse and breach. He would leave with what he brought in, and nothing more. Damon tried to argue, to charm, to intimidate. None of it landed. Silence, finally revealed, does not negotiate. Sarah spoke then, her voice quiet and unwavering. She named what he had done, not emotionally, but accurately: bruises, isolation, control. She did not ask for explanations, she delivered conclusions. Damon laughed once, sharply, then went very still as he realized there was no audience left for performance. The cameras kept rolling. I reminded him of that, gently. He gathered his things under our watch, every movement recorded, every word unnecessary. The house felt different after he left, lighter, as if a pressure valve had finally opened. Sarah sat on the stairs and cried then, deep and shaking, the kind of release that leaves no room for regret. I held her and said nothing until her breathing slowed. If this story resonates with you, if quiet strength feels familiar, subscribe and stay with us. Some victories do not shout, they endure. We spent the evening reviewing next steps, not legally theatrical, simply thorough. The trust activated exactly as designed, accounts locked, access revoked. Damon's messages escalated from pleading to anger, to silence. I did not respond. Silence had served its final function. It had revealed truth, protected my daughter, and closed the door behind him. Late that night, after Sarah slept, I returned to the cellar alone. I opened the fireproof cabinet. Damon could not breach and removed a single envelope addressed in my wife's hand. I had saved it for when Sarah was safe, when the cycle was ready to close. I stood there a long time, the paper warm in my hands, aware that what waited inside would change how Sarah understood everything that had happened. Upstairs, the house settled into its old rhythms, familiar and steady. I turned off the light, locked the cabinet, and carried the letter with me, knowing that the final silence would not be one of waiting, but of resolution. The weeks that followed unfolded without spectacle, and that was exactly how my wife had designed it. Victory, she believed, should feel like stability returning, not fireworks burning out too fast. Sarah moved back into the house quietly, carrying only what truly belonged to her. No shouting, no final confrontation. Damon's absence settled into the walls like clean air after a storm. Noticeable not because something was missing, but because something harmful was finally gone. The house breathed again, and for the first time in years, so did my daughter. The trust did its work with cold precision. Accounts froze. Access vanished. Ownership clarified itself on paper the way truth does, when no longer obstructed. Damon attempted contact at first, messages swinging wildly between remorse and accusation. Each one shorter than the last, until silence swallowed him completely. He left Los Angeles soon after, not defeated in public, but erased from relevance. That was the elegance of it. No one applauds when a parasite detaches, but the body remembers the relief forever. Sarah began to heal in ways that were not immediate but unmistakable. She slept deeply at first, long hours without interruption, her nervous system relearning safety. Bruises faded. Her posture changed. She started choosing her own clothes again, cooking meals the way she liked them, reclaiming small decisions that added up to autonomy. We talked late into the evenings, sometimes about what happened, sometimes about nothing at all. Healing, I learned, often begins in the ordinary. One night, when the house was quiet, and Sarah felt steady enough, I gave her the envelope. The paper was thick, aged, my wife's handwriting unmistakable. Sarah hesitated before opening it, sensing its weight. We sat together at the kitchen table as she read. The letter was calm, loving, devastating in its clarity. My wife wrote about patterns repeating across generations, about charm mistaken for care, about how love sometimes needs armor built long before danger appears. She wrote that if Sarah was reading this, it meant the protection had worked. That silence had done its job. Sarah cried then, not from pain, but from recognition. She said she finally understood why certain truths had been withheld, why patience had been chosen over confrontation. The letter did not predict Damon by name. It predicted behavior, entitlement, control, hunger. My wife had trusted the pattern more than the person, and she had been right. The cellar, the trust, the diary, all of it had been a message sent forward in time, waiting for the right moment to be opened. In the months that followed, Sarah reclaimed her future deliberately. She took control of her finances, reconnected with friends, and began volunteering at a shelter that helped women untangle themselves from quiet abuse. She did not frame herself as a victim. She framed herself as informed. Watching her, I understood that silence, when wielded with intention, does not weaken the next generation. It teaches them how to listen to what is unsaid. The house filled with life again. Laughter returned, tentative at first, then natural. Plans were made that did not include contingency or fear. Sometimes, sitting on the patio in the evenings, Sarah would ask me how I endured watching everything unfold without intervening sooner. I told her the truth, that endurance is not passive. It is active restraint, guided by trust and preparation. Silence, when chosen consciously, is not absence. It is presence without noise. The cellar remains locked, not because it is still needed, but because it has earned its rest. Its purpose was fulfilled. The documents are archived, the cameras dormant, the diary complete. I descend there less often now, though sometimes I pause at the top of the stairs. Listening to the quiet, remembering the woman who taught me that foresight is love stretched across time. I am older now, slower, but I am not fragile. I have learned that protecting those we love does not always look heroic from the outside. Sometimes it looks like waiting, watching, writing, trusting that truth, once fully assembled, will dismantle any lie without raising its voice. If you have ever held your breath to protect someone, if you have ever chosen patience over panic, then you understand this story. Silence did not make us small, it made us precise, and in the end, it made us free.